a retired homicide detective. I've interviewed thousands of people, from serial killers to ministers. Welcome to the interview room. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the interview room on this marvelous, amazing Sunday evening. We're so grateful that each and every one of you are here this evening, and we want to welcome you. If this is your first time here, we want to thank you for being here, number one. And number two, thank you for trusting us with your time. It's always important to know those that come through the door leave much better than they entered. And here at the interview room, we try to give you that value. So we ask one thing, and that's hit that subscribe button at some point during the program here on this live. If you can do that, that's all we ask. Nothing more, nothing less. And then once you do that, at the conclusion of this program in the evening, you give it to your friends, because a gift has no value unless you give it away. So you have to give it to your friends and your social media contacts. So a big thank you tonight to our mods, to the best mods on YouTube. They continue to always amaze me. Miss Sophia, Teresa M, Maui Girl, Mimi J2, and of course Laura. And always prayers for Teresa's husband, who is going through some procedures, and we need to make sure that we keep them in our thoughts and prayers. Well, as you can tell, we have an amazing panel already right in front of you. Tonight I'm joined by Dr. Ann Burgess and by Dr. Gary Brucato. You guys know them. If you haven't watched the Hulu series on Ann's life, get over to Hulu. You can still see it. And it's an amazing, almost an autobiography. There's a couple of changes in there. You know, she's much better looking than the actress that played her. But I'm teasing. But she's an amazing human being. And she's also the author of A Killer by Design. If you have not gone to Amazon and bought this book yet, you are missing a real treat. This is an amazing book, and this is one of many. She's done just hundreds of research papers as well. And of course, she was one of the original forensic folks who had the privilege of working with the FBI in the behavior science unit. Welcome, man, to tonight's show.
Thank you, Chris. Delighted to be here.
It's always a pleasure, sincerely. And you know what I need to do? I need to put, my mother would never forgive me. I'm sorry. I need to put my guest up at the top, and I need to get down here. Okay. Sorry about that. As you can tell, in the upper left-hand corner tonight is my dear friend, Dr. Gary Brucato, who is the author of The New Evil. And both of these books are available on Amazon, and the depths of their bios and the links to both of these books are in the links below of this description of this program this evening. So tonight we have a special treat. we're going to do something that nobody has thought of, and that is we're going to talk about the Menendez brothers because, one, Dr. Burgess played a pivotal role there. She was a witness in that trial when it was going on, and it's going to be really interesting. I've not heard her opinion. We've not talked about it yet. So I'm going to be sitting on the edge of my seat, kind of like you folks listening. And then, of course, the two of them, I know you guys are writing about Lizzie Borden.
Yes.
And it's going to be an interesting comparative analysis that we're going to come up with this evening because we're going to compare the two cases. And nobody has done that yet. And I know you guys are writing extensively about it for a new book coming out.
For the book we're doing with you.
Well, I have a small piece. I'm a small chip in a very large bag of some really important people. I'm just sometimes I'm the salt. I'm not even sure what it is at times, but thank you. So let's kind of I'm going to kind of give everybody just a little high, a 30,000-foot view of the Menendez brothers case. Everybody knows it. I mean, it's all over the news right now. There's, just a tremendous amount of buzz going on, and they got a hearing coming up. So it's going to be interesting to hear your opinions of where you think this thing goes. So the LA District Attorney said a few days ago he's seeking to resentencing for both Lyle and Eric for killing their parents in 1989. And it's interesting. This was the year that just before I went into homicide. So this case was cooking, just as I was starting to become an investigator and learn the craft. And the brothers are sentenced to life in prison without parole, which we call LWOP, life without parole. They have spent decades in prison. Lyle today is 56, and Eric is 53. And the DA said because they were younger than 26 when the crimes happened, they would be eligible for immediate parole if released. So all this is up to the Superior Court judge, who will make a decision in a hearing scheduled for November 26th. That said, everybody get your questions ready, because as we go along here, Dr. Burgess and Dr. Brucato like to answer your questions. And where in the world can you ask such professionals like this? I mean, direct questions other than the interview room. So we're grateful for that. So the gist of the case is the brothers killed their parents, Jose and Kitty Menendez, in their Beverly Hills home in 1989. At the time, the brothers were 21 and 18. Last year, a former member of the 1980s boy band said he had been molested by Jose Menendez, the father of the boys. Jose, 45, was a Hollywood executive and the head of RCA Records at the time of his murder. This was a big deal. It had everything. I mean, it had Hollywood, it had music, movies, you name it. It was a very huge deal at the time. They were shot. The parents were shot with a shotgun. Mom suffered a wound to the head, and there were 15 gunshot wounds, including one to the face. That's basically pellets. I'm assuming that's what the autopsy showed. And they were first sentenced in 1996 to life in prison without parole. There were two trials. The first trial, the brothers said they suffered abuse by their father in their first trial, and that trial ended up in a mistrial after the jury deadlocked. So, and then there was a second trial, and they were convicted of first-degree murder. So, with the resentencing now, a habeas petition argues that in certain evidence that had been presented at the trial, the outcome would have been different. And the LA District Attorney is now asking for the sentencing to be resentenced from murder to manslaughter. And so the prosecution in both trials contend that the brothers stood to inherit $14 million, and the prosecution at the time said that greed was the motive for the crime. The defense's position was that the boys were traumatized, and that's where Dr. Burgess comes in. She was a witness who testified in the first trial, and as we all know, she's a trauma and abuse expert, and that the prosecution argued that the brothers acted out of greed and they were to inherit $14 million, but that ended up in a hung jury. And of course, there was a lot of information that Dr. Burgess presented to the court. She actually had a chance, and I don't know if you're still in contact with him. Maybe, we could start off with, you got called in, you had an opportunity to do a forensics interview with him. How about if we start there? Can you share with us, Ann, how
Sure.
kind of unfolded?
Yeah, I was called by a colleague, Dr. John Conti, who at the time was at the University of Chicago and was editor of really a number one journal, Interpersonal Violence. And he started right out saying, have you heard about this case out in California, et cetera, et cetera? And I hadn't. And he said, well, go down and get a copy of People magazine. And he says, it's a purple cover. So that was my introduction to the Menendez shootings. So I went down, I did what John said. I went down, I got a copy of People magazine, and there it was. And I think that tells us a little bit about how much publicity that this case was receiving at that time. As I said, well, I'm all the way on the East Coast, John. You're all the way on the West Coast, or at the time. I said, news doesn't travel that fast. So that's when he said, well, get People magazine. So anyway, then he said, would you do it? And I said, well, are you doing it? And he said, yes. He was going to be the expert for Lyle. And he said, Leslie Abramson, and he gave her quite a build-up about her.
Quite famous even at that time.
Yes.
She had a lot of high-profile stuff. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And so anyway, I said, sure, she can call me. So long story short, we made arrangements. I went out and met with Eric and Lyle. Actually, I spent over 50 hours in the LA jail 3 separate times to get information. They kept kind of upping the kinds of things I could testify to. They actually qualified me in 3 different areas, one on crime scene, one on sexual trauma or child sexual abuse, and one on trauma. So that was how I got into it. And I always blame John Conti for
it. I've watched the testimony, your testimony.
Oh, dear.
And it's fascinating, by the way. I mean, you were on the stand quite some time, a long time.
A long time, yeah.
And I think they underestimated the fact that you had all of that experience in Quantico.
Right.
And when it all came, to the table. So give us a little insight into your first contact with the young man at the time.
Oh, when I first met Eric, of course, he was just typical with the legs and handcuffs and so forth, and then jail clothes. But he, I teach undergraduate students that are just about his age at that time. Maybe he was a little 22, 23. And he looked like one of my students, except for his clothing and what I just said. And he really talked that way. He was very down to earth. I asked him a question and he would answer it. So there was no defensive position, if you will. I mean, I've met with many other criminals and I liked him. I didn't find anything secretive about him or whatever, even though I knew there had to have been something that was going on, because I just didn't buy that the way the media was reporting it, that these were just greedy kids and wanted money. They had all the money. I said, this is not, something's wrong. There's something in the family, obviously, because they killed their parents. and they were quite accomplished. They were sports. We talked about sports. The first time I went out, or certainly the first day, I'd go out for almost a week at a time. And we just talked in general, what was jail like, just to kind of try to get some kind of relationship established. And the other thing I did when we finally, I felt that things were kind of pretty good between us, is I had him do some drawings and some sketches, and then use those to keep going back over, well, what happened here? And then what did she say at this point? He was very expressive on the drawings. He put in where it was. He put in stick figures, of course. He didn't do any specific drawing, but he had a lot of content on these pieces of paper. And I thought, well, maybe these will be useful at trial, or at least over time, because you can take the time you see that somebody, it can take years. In this case, took several years before the trial actually came to fruition. So that was really my first contact.
It's interesting you say that. Help the audience understand, and Gary, weigh in here. Why is it so important that drawing, traumatic drawing and the expression, where the victim gets an opportunity to express themselves through, that type of opportunity, drawing it out?
And go ahead.
Well, it gives the person that's interviewing, gave me an opportunity to kind of watch it, what I call it was a sensory type of interview. What did he see? What did he hear? Did he smell anything? Did he taste anything? Those are the kinds of things that I like to hear, to give me an understanding of how this whole process is kind of coming into his mind and into his memory. So I always find them very effective. I do it now with both adults and with children. So, and don't forget, these two were, well, I didn't do it with Lau, but I certainly did it with Eric to get the drawings.
And well, I actually just want to add something about this. Is first of all, did you find that Lyle was the more dominant of the two of them?
Yes, he was. He was older. Not that had to mean anything, but he definitely was. Not necessarily when they were together, though. They would go back and forth. And even if you watch some of the interviews where they have had them together, he doesn't dominate at that time. Now, he may have individually, and in terms of what I went through with what I was interested in that whole week leading up to the shootings, that was the critical time, or one of the critical times. They seem to have always said they made the decision together, and whatever they were going to do was together. And that was the same thing on the trial. They had been urged to do separate trials. And I know one of the attorneys always felt that if it had been separate trials, one of them would have not received as harsh a sentence as they did.
Right.
That's probably true. Anyway,
it's interesting, Anne, because you know that in the Nouveau, Michael Stone, who, by the way, it's his birthday today. He would have been 91. Michael Stone and I have a category for individuals that are in traumatic situations and kill in that context, which is one of the possibilities that people are thinking about here, of course. And what we found when we looked at those cases is that the dynamics that cause the killing actually go on for a very long time. And then when the killing finally happens, the expression is a kind of overkill, because the person, all the pent-up feeling that the person has pours out. Sometimes it's even trauma from a previous thing, like let's say you had an abusive household and now you have an abusive husband and you kill him. It all pours out in that explosion. And I think we'll talk about how that there are interesting parallels with Lizzie Borden case. But the thing is that we found is that even though it goes on for a really long time, there's usually a very there's an immediate event that finally makes the people say, it's do or die. We've got to do this now. And we'll talk about when we get to Lizzie what that was, why the clock was ticking. But was there a kind of precipitant that made it more urgent in that moment? Because we like to think it's that the trauma hit the peak and they couldn't take it anymore. But it's usually that it's the trauma and now some other emergent event sets the fire to the straw. So what happened there?
Well, and that's what the drawings show. There was something that happened each day.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like one, and you're absolutely right. There are some situations where one thing just, opens the floodgates. They had several, and the reason I think there were several is because it was such a horrific act to think about, is that they couldn't do it. It had to build over time, that both of the parents, because there was, people always say, well, why was Kitty, shot and et cetera? Well, there's good reason. And you look at the drawings of what had happened. And that, I think the Tuesday before shooting happened on a Sunday. And so each day there was something that led up to it.
So like a last straw, it started to feel like a last straw.
Yeah, because when we get to the use of the weapon, especially with Lizzie and then with the Menendez, I think it's quite interesting what happens, or how we analyze it.
The overblow, yeah, right.
Yeah.
So there you are sitting with Eric, and you're having him express his feelings visually through writing. And what was the main, where did you start to, initially, I know how these things go in terms of, forensic interviews with doctors. I've read hundreds of your guys' reports and that kind of stuff in this. But at some point, there's a transition where this idea of, okay, I don't think the audience completely understands what the role of what your role was. Your role was there to just kind of seek the truth, whatever the truth was, whether it's a plus or a minus. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah, you have to get enough information to write a report. I mean, what's your opinion? That's the basis. Is what is your opinion about why this happened?
Yep.
Was there a motive? All those kinds of things.
And that opinion, you were actually voir dired in 3 areas of expertise. Can you tell the audience what those were?
Yes. Originally, Leslie Abramson had wanted me for the sexual abuse of children. That's what a lot of my research had been on, et cetera. And so I know that she had tried one other person and it didn't work out, had brought one other person out to interview. And I didn't know that at the time. It's interesting to learn about it afterwards. But so sexual abuse, and then the trauma, of course, what's the outcome of that trauma? And then the other big area was crime scene investigation. I think that's something you'd be, some of your audience is interested in that. So those are the 3 areas that I was qualified in, and I was testify before both juries on those.
Yeah, because the prosecution's theory was obviously, the motivation here was greed, money, let's take our parents out. And the defense's theory was, this idea of no, there's more here behind the scenes. What's the formation of we call mens rea, right? The evil intent. Is there an evil intent here? And I think folks didn't understand that part of what the prosecution was saying was, no, this was a staged crime scene because there was premeditated. They had bought the weapon at a big 5 store, and et cetera, et cetera. And yet you were able to come in and being down the middle and being objective to the truth, lay out what your findings were. And so when you were talking to Eric, how did you take him down that road? How did you get him there?
Well, I just took him down by, we really went through we did a lot of your typical background, tell me about your background growing up, going to school, playing tennis, all of those very traditional, I guess you'd say. And then, of course, after I got that information in, and because I had other documents, I always try to check the documents. They were matching. There was nothing they were saying that was out of line, especially on his schooling. What had impressed me at that point is the meeting with teachers who were intimidated themselves by Jose primarily, Jose and Kitty, that they would go to when they got a grade. One of the boys, Eric, got a grade like a B. They went and to see the teacher to find out. And I was shocked by that because I've been teaching, my whole career. I've never had a parent come in and say they wanted to talk about their child's grade. I mean, that was way over the line. So I found that really interesting. If teachers could be intimidated and change the grade, they changed the grade, which I felt was rather, anyway. So I had some really good background information just on that. So then when it came to, so how do we get to this point? Help me understand, I said to Eric, help me understand what this was all about. You killed you shotgunned your parents. And that's where he said it really started that week before. There were a number of things, and we went through them. Right. There was the mother knew when he ever found out that the mother knew about the abuse and did nothing. People say, well, how could they kill their mother? Well, there's one good reason. She wasn't going to protect them. And that Lyle's solution to the problem, not telling his mother about, was that they would go back to the East Coast. He'd go back to Princeton, which he was going to be able to. He had been suspended and he was going to go back. But the mother wouldn't go. Certainly Eric would go. But when they realized that was all around the mother and how to get out of a bad situation, they realized she'd never leave the father, and she was in the marriage, and et cetera, et cetera. So was
mom an alcoholic? Did she have a drinking problem?
Well, she certainly liked to drink. Let me put it that way. I don't know whether you'd call her an alcoholic, but some people did.
Okay.
I don't know. But anyway, drugs and probably into not prescription drugs. I don't think she was into anything more than that.
So how old was Lyle was the oldest, right? And Eric
yes.
was okay.
And Eric is 2 years younger.
Okay. So how it came out that the father or Eric had told Lyle about the abuse, the sexual abuse going on. Okay.
He didn't know it was still going on.
Okay, walk us through that. How did you get him to get to that place?
Well, Lyle had been molested by his father when he was about the same age. I think it was 6 or 8, around there, that age range. And then the father had stopped. And then, because that's not unusual, that he would then go to the younger boy. And he kept Eric in the relationship. And that is something that Lyle didn't know. And in fact, during the trial, Lyle did publicly apologize to his brother, who's sitting there at the witness table, to say he was very sorry. He did not realize that. So that was the issue around the sexual abuse. And Eric was pretty open about how it happened, where it happened. And I think the thing is, and that it continued. And someone asked him, well, why did it continue? Why didn't you, a typical question is, why didn't you just tell him to stop? Well, the answer was, it was the affection he was getting. He was close with his father. And so it was not something that he necessarily wanted to stop. And I don't think people understand that well enough. And that's why some youngsters do stay in the abusive situation. And that's what he said. So do you have a question? Oh, so anyway, the next thing that we found out, especially through the drawings, is that Eric thought he was going to get out of the situation by going to college, and that he would go and live in the dorm. And he wanted to go to, I think it was Berkeley, which would be he would be far enough away and could live in the dorm. And the father said, no, you're going to go to UCLA. And we'll get you I think he said something like, we'll get you a moped. Can't believe that. But isn't that a scooter kind of thing? Yeah. And he could back and forth.
Mhm.
which to me is, I think, pretty dangerous. If he's in LA and he's on this little scooter, I couldn't get him a car.
Gary
Anyway,
drives a moped in Manhattan. He closes
yeah,
his
right.
eye.
Yeah, but I always found that eerie, that Jose wasn't this charmer that everyone had said he was. So anyway, that was one of the key things. The other thing is that the mother, there was this big scene in the foyer of their house where the mother grabs Lyle's toupee. That's where also they talked about Lyle was losing his hair and was wearing a toupee, and the mother mocks him and grabbed that toupee. I mean, that had to have been such an embarrassing, humiliating kind of a situation. And then,
That's interesting in of itself, because people, the movies and all this stuff, portrays that as the mother pulling his hair out, as kind of a, an angry gesture. But in reality, it sounds like what I'm hearing you say, that was more of a humiliation gesture.
oh, I took it as a humiliation gesture. Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Like
And-
sad.
Yeah, and Gary, I'm interested in what your thoughts are on, because there's a 3-year age gap here. The older brother, had been being abused by dad, and it sounded like he was either aging out or he was he was now going to bring both of them into the circle. What are your thoughts on to that?
Well, and if I'm not mistaken, the idea is that you're suggesting that the father, typical of pedophilic individuals, had a kind of age range he was interested in, and then the boy aged out, so then he would go for the younger. But the idea would be that probably with the advent of like adolescence, he would have lost interest in it. We saw this, I think, in the modern day case of the Madeline, the Soto case, where there's this question of why this little girl had to be killed as soon as she turned 13. Part of the motive might have been that she aged out, or that she
Sure.
became aware that what was happening, perhaps she might want to share with other people, something like that. So I think that in many ways is kind of typical. But the thing is, and do you think that if either one of them were experiencing it alone, they would have mustered up this kind of strength to kind of try to do something to get out of it, or express rage or anything like that? Do you think it took the two of them? Because in a lot of these cases where siblings are abused by the same parent, they get together to commit the act.
Yeah. Well, that's what it was leading to, with all these things going on in this one week. And don't forget, this is August. Lao's supposed to be getting, a lot of things are going on that were really weighing on both of the boys for different reasons at that time. And I think, and they had to get together and decide what to do, because don't forget, the big family secret is about to come out, and that people don't understand. I don't think understand as well as we made it not clear enough. But incest is a huge issue, and here you have Jose as this big records head of the RCA records, and what would that do to his career? That's a heavy
Right.
stake.
Yeah, he was done.
Yeah, he was done. He'd be done. Yeah. Well, this is back. Don't forget, it's back in the 90s. But that's where it's at.
So there's a pattern of abuse here. I'm sorry, Gary.
No. I was just going to say that. Is that okay, Chris? You want me to hold my thought?
Go ahead.
I'll be quick. So what I was going to say is that there are other cases, and they almost seem to have a lot of commonalities. That's what first led to this idea of thinking about the Borden case alongside the Menendez case, is that there seemed to be this almost formulaic thing that seems to happen. And for example, there's a very interesting case that, if you were living in Russia, would be common knowledge, that in the United States is not known very well. But there's the case of the 3 Khachaturian sisters, who at 17, 18, and 19 were all being systematically abused sexually by their father. And they decided collectively that two of them were going to hold a pillow over his head while the other beat him to death with a hammer. And there is to this day a huge public outcry that they are heroes who stood up to a monstrous father who was committing incest day in and day out with three sisters. And they are still in jail, as far as I understand it, but they posthumously charged last year the father for the sexual assault and other things, including distribution of outrageous pornography and other things. But that is one of the common factors in these cases, is that once you identify that there was abuse, you start to say, well, this isn't a person killing because they enjoy it. They're probably never going to offend again. They're just a person who was in a circumstance where they felt helpless, and they were empowered by having another person experiencing the same thing. It gave a kind of permission structure, like, let's get out of this together. We'll do it together. And then they get out of the scenario, and or at least they think they're going to. But I think, and what made this so complicated is that there were two boys. I think that one of the things we're going to have to think about is that maybe people weren't ready in 1993 to be thinking that, you know, two boys could be the victims of sexual trauma. That there was a kind of a bias. Don't you think that there's truth to that?
Oh, I do, definitely. And I think where you're going with this is that it had been the Menendez sisters, you wouldn't have had this outcome.
Well, that's
because, well, Judy Herman's book was out in 1984 on father-daughter incest. It was a huge book. I mean, made a lot of impression on people. So people were able to talk about, I had been doing cases like that in the 80s. So now we're into the 90s.
Yeah.
But the male on male, let alone father-son, was not out. I even wrote a paper. I just happened to go through my resume on father-son incest back in the 80s.
Interesting. Yeah. Oh, I'm waiting for the male Me Too movement. That hasn't happened yet, but I think that there is an enormous underreporting by males of these things. I mean, that lead to these statistics that are questionable. And I mean, I think, Chris, you know, as somebody who specialized in crimes against children, that there's an enormous amount of offenses of this type against males. But they don't like to talk about it as much, or it gets hidden, or it's not masculine, or whatever. And I think that that's partly why the drawings were so clever, because he didn't have to talk.
Yeah,
it wasn't necessary to go through the humiliation of voicing it.
Yeah, that's
I think
true.
males are very visual creatures, you know. That's
it's really interesting to see, you know, how you unpack this, you know, whole psychological edge of this, this really is a very important case, because, you know, there's such passion on both sides of the coin, right? I mean,
Yes.
you have on one side of the coin, you know, there's no way, they're making it up, it's all a bunch of lies, you know, et cetera, and it's just an excuse to murder. And then you have on the other side of the coin that says, well, wait a minute, what if all this is true? And, you know, they started, you know, children don't get an opportunity, you know, to choose their parents, right? That's just one of those universal things, that the universe is on schedule. Whether it's the right schedule or not is always determined later on in life. But here you have a situation that's really lining up to be not only one of the most high profile cases. Here we are in 2024 still talking about it. But at the time, nobody would have projected, you know, 30 years later, that somebody else would come forward and say, hey, I need to tell you something. That guy did this to me too, and I'm not in the family. And, you know, he molested me. At that time, you know, in 92, I remember I went to Walla Walla State Prison, and I interviewed Wesley Dodd.
Ugh.
And here's a guy, right, who built up all of that anger, all of that release from all of that violence. And yet, I don't know if there was ever a significant piece of evidence that said, yeah, he was physically molested. Now, he molested children, but was he of the victimology type that when you sit down with Eric and all of a sudden he starts drawing out and saying, look, here's what's happened to me. And then Lyle gets involved in when they were going through the first, let's say the last 10 days, getting close to the crime. I know there was the boat ride.
Right.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, the boat ride was Friday night. That was pretty significant, very significant. Trying to think of, it was shark fishing. It had been scheduled for Thursday night. And so when the mother said that it had been postponed, that upped their anxiety even more, because they were thinking, well, maybe they're going to do something to us on the boat. Maybe they'll push us off. Shark fishing is what they were going for, push us off into the sharks. And so they kind of huddled, and there was good testimony from the captain of the boat that the two brothers were way up at the front of the boat, huddled together. And he and the Jose and Kitty were back in the back of the boat, or wherever drop, wherever the motor was. So that was a very, very important, because that, I think, is when the brothers really had said, we have to do something, and push them, because that was Friday, then Saturday, and then of course Sunday was the day that they did it.
Did you sense that there was paranoia had set in, or was getting, close to the?
Well, I think that's where that's why I liked the imperfect defense, because they were terrified that something was going to happen, that the parents were going to kill them. But to other people, they thought it was, that made no sense. It wasn't logical. And that's why they call it the imperfect defense. You can't call it self-defense, but you can call it imperfect defense. And I think that both lawyers, certainly Leslie, thought that would be the way, because they said they did it. There's no question that they had shot their parents. It was just a matter of what was the sentence going to be? What was the charge? Was it first degree, or was it going to be manslaughter?
Right. Was it a crime of passion, or was it a crime of
how planned and so forth? Yeah. They
And
tried to say on the planning, well, they went out and bought these shotguns. Well, they went to get handguns, but learned that they had to wait, and they were so scared they couldn't wait. That doesn't seem logical. Were the parents going to kill them that fast that they couldn't wait, whatever the waiting period is? I don't think it's a long waiting period. So then they get these shotguns, which has the wrong guns. They don't even get the right ammunition. So look at the amount of, when you talk about the overkill, they didn't even know how to shoot a gun. And then they had these shotguns, and if anyone's ever used a shotgun, they're heavy, and they get a kick, and they make a lot of noise. Talk about the wrong guns. And so they certainly had not planned that in that to what was going to happen. In my opinion. Now, that's just my opinion, obviously.
And then also, I think, for us, we talk about this all the time, but I think the audience might find it interesting that in every one of the victims, and we're going to see this in the Borden case too, that the victims are all killed by injuries above the neck. They're all facial injuries, decimation of the face or the head of the individual. And I think that has a significance in these emotionally charged domestic situations.
Yeah.
Should we talk about that a minute, about what that might mean? Yeah, because I think it has a huge meaning. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, are we ready to talk about do our comparison?
Let's do that here, but let's answer a couple of questions real quick.
Okay.
Did Eric and Lyle get medical records to use as proof in the trials? Anybody know? Do you recall?
I've never seen anything related to that case that they got copies of medical records.
Me neither.
Did you?
Their medical records.
Oh, I'm sure that they, the DA in LA, they were very thorough. I'm sure they had their medical records for both any kind of psychological evals or anything.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, they were court ordered. You were court ordered.
Yeah. There are a lot of records to go through. Yes.
But like
Um,
somebody in the audience asked when we were speaking a minute ago, they said, did they have a therapist, and why did the therapist not report if there was abuse?
Well,
Report?
ethically, he was wrong. Right. He said how he wanted to get in on the money. I mean, that was a horrific interchange. Yeah.
So Chrissy asks, what's your theory on why this horrific situation happened? And then she compliments you, as always. Your insight is so interesting.
Well, the theory is that they felt that they were going, when the incest secret came out, that before it came out, that the parents, once they knew it was going to come out, would harm them. And they felt that they were that something would happen to them. And so the only way they could come up with, in their thinking, imperfect as it was, is that they would kill them. They would shoot them first. And that's what happened.
Yeah, and this is an interesting comment. That's correct. I don't know if you've ever seen the show on Netflix called Killer Sally, where the two weightlifters, the husband and wife, they were both in the Marines. I worked that crime scene.
Oh, wow.
And his whole side of his face was blown away. And she's sitting in prison too. And we'll see. But it was very personal. And any kind of shot or a thing like that, there's always it's an emotional response, right? And we could get into that. But we've got some really other interesting stuff here. So the trial goes on. The boys are convicted. The men now, they were men at the time. They weren't, but they were victims of child abuse. And I think that's something that had been shown. It had been testified to, and it's never been argued other than opinionated that the prosecution felt, no, that's not the case. And the defense says, well, yes, it is the case. And now here we are in 2024 with another victim, a third victim. And I would submit to you there are many more if that's going to be how this whole thing is going to unwind. Would you disagree with me, docs? If he did it to his children.
Oh, right. I would agree. Yes. And in fact, there was a lot of attempt to try to find someone. And interesting enough, I remember they're going to Mexico, which I think is where this young, the young Menendez band.
Menudo? Yeah.
Were they from Mexico? I don't know.
You mean the band Menudo?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd have to look it up, but do you know, Chris, off the top of your head?
Yeah, Menudo at the time.
Yeah, and
they were just coming into.
There was some talk about, could they find some victims of Jose from that, child victims.
Puerto Rico.
Yeah,
I think Marissa is saying here.
Yeah,
okay. Puerto Rico, sure. Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so, but right? I mean, you now have somebody coming and saying, hey, well, wait a minute, that, I have to come out here and let people know that I too was a victim. And so that's always, it's always interesting because, you just don't know. I mean, you just don't know. You have a theory, but you just don't know. But there was a desperation that obviously took place. I thought from the very beginning, this should have been a manslaughter, just based on the testimony, based on everything that everybody heard. I mean, if it reminds me of the guy who was on the phone when his son had been molested and the perpetrator was being escorted by him, and we had him on the show. Remember that? I forget his name. Forgive me.
Yeah, Gary knows it.
Gary, what was that young man whose father shot the suspect at the airport?
Oh, Jody Plauché.
Jody, right? And we talked to Jody. I mean,
yeah, we know we're friendly with him. He's a great guy.
Yeah, he was, but this is one of those situations where the father, spontaneously, boom, out of anger, but his motivation was anger, but it was an emotional response, which fits the definition of manslaughter. So and so that is a perfect segue, I think, into our next conversation here, and that's the correlation between, let's say, the Menendez brothers, and you guys have been studying Lizzie Borden. I don't think anybody's really crossed this bridge yet. So explain what we've got going on here between the two of you.
I'm going to let Gary start because he came up with this table. I think it's brilliant. I really love it. So you get started.
We'll use it. Maybe we'll use it for the book. But first of all, it's important to put into context that the Lizzie Borden case is a cold case, right? Technically a cold case, because as we'll see, Lizzie Borden was acquitted and no one else was tried. Almost makes one wonder why they didn't bother to try to pin it on anyone else. But anyway, but the idea is that we are writing, including with Chris, we're writing a book as we speak on cold cases, on the Cold Case Foundation, and the work we do in that wonderful group, which is led by Greg Cooper. And so the Menendez case, of course, is not a cold case, but we thought that it would be interesting when thinking about how to approach a case that is cold. You think about similar cases, because the truth is there's nothing new under the sun in a lot of ways. You can learn about one case by comparing it to another, and these were both cases with very rich family dynamics that have to be understood to really get the motive, to really make sense out of what might have gone on. It is fascinating that by complete coincidence, the Lizzie Borden case and the Menendez case were both trials of the century, and they were separated by exactly a century. The Lizzie Borden trial was in 1893, and the Menendez cases started in 1993, and both of them involved rich families and became enormously sensationalized in the press. And I think in many ways the Lizzie Borden case was really one of the first cases in American history where it became like a spectator sport to be interested in true crime and in a horrible story. But what it really is a kind of domestic drama where all the sordid details of what was going on became titillating and exciting to the public, because they were hearing all the little minutiae, and it was very Shakespearean and kind of theatrical. So they got sucked into the Borden story. So basically, just to kind of put things into context, you have to understand that very critical to this tale is the setting in Fall River, Massachusetts, because Fall River has a river that goes through it, the Kikachi, and that is vital to what it is that made that a center of industry. The Kikachi River has a sort of way that it flows that made it possible for people to build textile mills there where they wouldn't get flooded. The water could drive the wheels without them getting flooded. And as a consequence, it became known as Spindle City, Textile City. By the time you get to the early to middle part of the 1800s, Fall River is arguably the most important textile center in the United States. And Andrew Borden, the father of Lizzie Borden, the biological father of Andrew Borden, was one of its richest inhabitants. He had descended directly from people who founded the town and had a kind of a stranglehold on the entire place. Now, you have to understand the psychology of this man. It's really very interesting. I agree with John Douglas, the chairman emeritus, I think, of the Cold Case Foundation and a household name in true crime. I agree with him in a profile that he created in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, about the Lizzie Borden case, that Andrew Borden might best be described as having an obsessive-compulsive personality. I think that's probably true. He was, despite coming from what would now be about $6 million in money tucked away in the bank, he made the family live in a kind of dirt poor house on State Street in Fall River, in the poorer part of town near the immigrant center, there were a lot of Portuguese Catholic immigrants coming into that part, and he made them live right near there instead of up on the hill, which is where all the rich people lived, including their own family members who were kind of hanging out up there. And there was no plumbing in the house. You had to go to the bathroom in a bucket and dump it. when you were done. You know, everything was, you know, no gas in the house, nothing like that. And they lived this kind of impoverished existence. He would always wear black, sometimes probably the same outfit for days on end to save money on pressing things. He was very austere, and he would make these very meticulous rounds and do the same thing every single day like a robot. Now, against the backdrop of that, this is what you have to understand. He has a wife who, when Lizzie's older sister, Emma, she has an older sister who's 9 years older, and then there is a second sister who dies. She has hydrocephalus. She lives for 2 years, and then she passes away, and then Lizzie's born. And we don't really know much about the psychology of what went on there, but Lizzie becomes this object of excessive protection because the second daughter has died. And so there's always like, Emma, take care of little Lizzie, you know. And while that's happening, the mother now passes away. The mother dies of what we believe was an ectopic pregnancy. She dies on her deathbed. She tells Emma, take care of Lizzie. So now she's got frozen in her head that she's got to protect this kid who's going to be a little bit of trouble as time goes on. The father was about 20 years and change older than the mother. And I agree with John Douglas that was probably because he was something of a control freak and would have liked being with somebody who was significantly younger and kind of dependent on him. He waits a little while and he remarries another woman who is about 20 years younger than him. And the kids are in a situation, you've got to understand, Gilded Age America. Emma and Lizzie, neither of them ever marries. And it's a problem that if you don't get married in Gilded Age America as a woman, you cannot move out of your parents' house. It was considered outrageous to live on your own. So they're kind of stuck there in the house. Emma is sort of given over to this. She kind of accepts it, that it's not going to happen for her. Lizzie, on the other hand, is ferociously upset about it and cannot wait to marry and get out of that house. Now, superficially, Lizzie is a very friendly person. You know, she's kind of Christian, active in church activities. She loves animals to an unbelievable degree, way more than she seems to like people. She loves animals. And what happens is that there's this, you know, she has her 33rd birthday in July of 1863, a month before the murders. She went away for a trip. The father had given her some time before to go to Europe with her friends. And on the way home, she said to the friends, I don't want to go back there. I hate being there. It's miserable. I like this life. You know, I don't want to. So you already get the hints of someone who just doesn't like their financial situation and living in poverty. And she starts to loathe, and I mean loathe, her stepmother. She won't eat with the stepmother. She feels that she's taking a kind of a power over the father a little bit. She starts giving things away to her own sister that, like, really and technically they feel should have gone to Lizzie and her sister. And they just start hating each other, you know. And so what happens is, right before the murders, this uncle comes to visit. Uncle John comes to visit. And there's talk in the living room of changing the will. And this is essential to the story because the way that it seems it would go is that if the father died, everything would pass to the stepmother, and the stepmother could give some of the stuff away to her own family. But if she dies first, even if the father dies 5 minutes later, everything passes to Lizzie and the sister. This is going to be crucial to the story of why it's very suspicious that the mother dies. The stepmother gets killed first. Okay, it had to work that way legally. So what happens is on August 4th, 1893, was a Thursday. It was a incredibly hot day. It was so hot that they had people all over town that were sick. And the day before, Abby, the stepmother, Abby, had gone to the doctor across the street saying that she thought maybe somebody had poisoned the mutton. The father, being a cheapskate.
What's a mutton?
It's like a parts of lamb that you eat that was
It's the
prepared.
worst, it's the worst piece of lamb that you can get.
Right.
And it had been left out. Tell them how badly. I mean,
Yeah,
it was left
exactly.
out on this all day after. Oh,
Right,
so
and the father wouldn't let them get rid of anything because he was so cheap. So it was sitting out for days. And what happened is a whole bunch of people in the family got sick. And what's fascinating is that instead of interpreting it that it was just illness and that the heat had made the food spoil, rapidly, and she starts wondering if somebody has tried to poison them, which is a really interesting interpretation. What reason did she have to think that anybody was trying to poison them, right? And so what happens is Lizzie is in the house, and Bridget, who is the Irish-born maid, is asked, even though she's sick and vomiting, she's asked to clean every single window in the house, inside and out. Now, we have to imagine that if Lizzie had already made her mind up to kill the stepmother and the father that day, she was kind of bedeviled by the fact that now Bridget is going to be in and out of the house all day. And so, interestingly, she tells her a made-up story. And she tells Bridget testified that she told her that there was this dress sale that she could go to if she left the house, where she could get some fantastic deal on a dress. And don't you want to go? And so Bridget gets excited and says, okay, I'm going to wash all the windows and I'm going to get out of the house and go to a dress sale. So that's also very fishy. Okay. Now, what happens is you have to picture that Bridget is outside and she's cleaning windows where she could clearly see into this house. I've been to that house. It's pretty small. I mean, I could picture it like it was yesterday, every inch of it. She could see into the windows clearly. You've got Lizzie in the house. The stepmother's in the house, right? Okay. So here's the deal. Lizzie comes outside making a big fuss to Bridget. You've got to go get someone. Somebody killed father. Okay. Now, the point is she pretends that Abby's not even in the house. And this story gets told. No one has ever substantiated it. She tells the story that a note came to the house telling Abby that she had to go visit a sick friend. When she tells that story, Abby is already mutilated upstairs on the second floor, dead in the guest bedroom she was cleaning up where Uncle John had slept. So now Bridget goes. They fetch the neighbor. The neighbor comes into the house. It's horrifying. The father had come into the house, went into the couch in the sitting room, and was mutilated above the neck with some kind of hatchet-like instrument, 10 to 11 blows, especially with his eyes open. And the scene is very strange because there are things there that never would have happened. The father never would have done this. Apparently, he takes this coat that he wears all the time to save money and keeps it as neat as possible, breaks his habits, which he never does, and rolls it up like a pillow to put under his head to take a nap in the middle of the day on the couch. And there's blood spatter all over the wall, which doesn't match the position that he's in. And the story is supposedly that a complete stranger came in the house and killed him. Now, this makes no sense because Bridget says Lizzie never went in or out. No one was in the house I would have seen. There was only one little brief moment where she stepped away and was gossiping over the fence with the maid of the neighbors. But it would have been pretty strange that she wouldn't have seen somebody go in or out of the house at all. Now, here's the really interesting part. When the father got home that day, the front door was locked, which never happened. The father always kept the front door open except at nighttime. Front door was locked, almost as if Lizzie wanted a signal when he came home. Bridget opens the door, and Lizzie is standing at the top of the stairs. You can show the map, Chris. She's standing at the top of the stairs.
Okay, hang on.
And she starts making fun of Bridget, who's struggling with the door. Now, this is very creepy. See that front entrance with that staircase there at the bottom next to the parlor?
And let's tell the audience you actually went to the house.
Oh, yeah. I went to that house several times and sleep in that house. And so when you get to the top of that staircase, you're going to see the room in which Abby is dead. You can't miss her body on the floor. When Lizzie was mocking Bridget opening the door to let the father in, she is standing next to the room where we find out later Abby is dead. she would have seen the mother there. And she's cracking jokes, you know, at the top of the stairs, making fun of her. Okay. So now she goes down coolly and collectedly. I have no idea where stepmother is. She went out to go visit a friend because a note came, blah, blah, blah. So then they start getting nervous. She's not there. We better check upstairs. They get the neighbor, Bridget. They go upstairs, and big, great shock. They see Abby has been mutilated there. The autopsies are done. They determine there's about an hour, at least, between these murders. Okay? So then we're going to see later when this goes to trial, they had an architect take a look at the house and try to figure out where could somebody have hidden for an hour with Abby, with no one in the house other than Lizzie and the dead mother, the dead stepmother, until the father comes home. And there was only this little tiny closet in the front of the house where it would have been possible, but it wouldn't have been possible, really. Lizzie would have heard them. It made no sense at all, except that that Lizzie was the person who did it. So, of course, they start investigating, and immediately it becomes clear to them something doesn't smell right in this situation, as you would say, Chris. Something's wrong in River City, as you always say, right? There's something is not adding up because, first and foremost, Lizzie is not having any kind of normal emotional reaction. She doesn't actually shed a single tear until she is acquitted. Not one drop. Now, we might say maybe she was traumatized. Maybe she was so upset that, you know, but that struck the officers very rapidly that it made no sense. And in the investigation, what they found was that the mother was struck first in front of her face. She would have seen the attacker. She was hit in the side of her head. She spun around and then was butchered in the back of her head with massive overkill with a hatchet-like instrument, struck about 18 to 19 times in the back of the head by someone straddling her. So we have to picture that, right? Lizzie on top of this woman, just butchering her over and over again in the back of the head. And she just dies there in a pool of blood, hunched over next to the bed that Uncle John had slept in. The father, the mutilation is about 10 to 11 blows by what was thought to probably be the same hatchet-like instrument. And what's fascinating is that there is this almost mutilation of the open eyes, as if that might have a psychological significance to the attacker. You know, we think about that. This hatcheting of the eyeballs, which is not inconsistent, actually, with people who have been abused.
Okay, so hang on right there just for a sec.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, because there's a lot to unpack here.
Oh, yeah, we didn't even get to the trial yet.
I know, right, and that's why I want to go back to the chart here for a minute, because I think
start to compare them. Right. Yeah.
Let's do the comparative analysis here. So we've got the Menendez brothers, right? The chief suspects, and of course, you know, on the left column here, like you talk about, it's almost 100 years. It's a century from one to the other. I just thought that just that one fact alone was like, well, that's fascinating.
Yeah, you can't make stuff up. Yeah.
So then break down the other two columns here for the audience, Gary.
So first of all, I think given the motives that were present here, I'm pretty sure that if they couldn't establish an alibi for the sister who was away visiting friends elsewhere, probably would have been implicated in some way in this, because both of the sisters had that same problematic relationship in the home, couldn't get out of it, and, to be frank, stood to inherit an enormous sum of money. You're talking about $6 million. Same dynamics you had going on in the Menendez situation. We have a double parricide where there's this motive of money versus upset about some dynamic in the household, which in the case of Lizzie, we'll see, might have even included abuse, which was speculated about even at the time in the papers. Now, so if Abby had at least some awareness of what was going on, we have the more dominant Lizzie and her sister. One of the things Anne pointed out that I thought was fascinating is that Anne pointed out that it was two sisters and two brothers, same sex. We don't know how that, like, would it have been different if Lyle had a sister who was being abused? It's interesting that it's two men and two women. And so in some way, I have always suspected that Abby in some way had an inkling that her sister was guilty. I think Bridget also had an inkling. and there was a little bit of a protection of them.
Okay.
Of
Dr. Burgess, you want to say something to that? You want to weigh in there?
Oh, I was just going to say, before we get too far, it was also very, very hot both times. August, same month.
Oh yeah, for the murders. That's a good point.
Murders, yeah, that was that. And the did you mention about there's always one writer had suspected incest between the father and Lizzie.
Right. Well, the idea is, first of all, the father had a very unique relationship with Lizzie. The only piece of jewelry he wore on his entire body, he wore it. He had it on. You know, it's even buried with him. Was a ring that Lizzie had given him, and that was a really big deal that he had that special bond with her. They would go fishing together, spend a lot of time alone with nobody else around when when she was a kid. And then these weird things start to happen, like, for example, she starts locking the door that is shared with his, that would have an opening to where he would sleep. And a lot of people interpreted that as being very peculiar for someone living in the house with their father, that you want to lock your father out of the room. And there was speculation in the papers at the time, maybe he was looking at her, or he was doing something that made it a little inappropriate why she would do that. Now, it is kind of puzzling to think about. I think you'd agree, Anne, it is kind of hard to reconcile why a young woman would feel the need to do that.
And what was the story about the key that he left on the mantle?
Right. Well, what happened was that about a year before the murders, there was a robbery in the Borden house. But Lizzie had a little bit of a reputation for kleptomania in town, where he would go around like fixing. In fact, she even robbed many years later after the murder. She got caught shoplifting a painting. She had a little problem with that. And
the boys were
father suspected.
The boys were accused of that as well.
That's right, of stealing. You're right. You're right. Yeah.
I have a theory about why that is. I think that's not uncommon in abused kids who feel their parents aren't taking care of them, that it forces the parents to be involved in a way where they come in and get punished, because their own reputation could be damaged unless they fix the mess that's made by the kids. It's like an expression of anger. But the thing is, I think the father suspected that Lizzie actually did the robbery in the house and made it look like outsiders did it. And so what he would do was he would lock, his own area so that nobody could go in and rob it. And then, as a little code to her, I think, and John Douglas interpreted it the same way, he would put the key on the mantle where Lizzie knew where it was. A way of saying, I'm worried about somebody breaking in, but you know where this key is, Lizzie. So if anybody gets in, I'll know who did it. And there was a very strange relationship between them that I think added a little extra fuel to the fire. Anyway, long story short, what winds up happening is they do this investigation, and I have to explain this before the rest of this chart is going to make sense. And they find all these things that are very, very strange. Lizzie burning a dress with blood on it in a stove. She claims that she had a flea bite, which was Victorian slang for menstruation. So nobody's going to ask her any more about it because it was inappropriate. Was that really menstrual blood? Whatever. So that she's burning a dress. Then she claims that there was paint on it, and that's why she had to burn it. That makes no sense, because Andrew used to make them keep all the rags to use for chores. Then there's this thing where they go down in the basement and they find blood-soaked rags in buckets that are downstairs. There's all these kind of excuses for all these strange things. They find multiple hatchets that are downstairs, but they can't link them to the murders in any clear way. And what winds up happening is that Lizzie starts giving all these totally contradictory stories of her alibi. And they get to a kind of inquest situation, and she's totally self-incriminating, but the judge tosses it all because he says she was under the influence of a medication to calm her nerves. So it all gets tossed. And by the time you get to trial, the judge, who was put in place as a judge by a member of her own defense team when he was in political office, basically tosses out piece by piece everything that would have been incriminating And she winds up getting acquitted, even though the facts so strongly point to her. And the most damning and problematic thing I found in researching the case, this absolutely fascinated me, and then I want to walk through this chart quickly, is that there was a murder nearby, a hatchet murder nearby. Not when they were getting ready for that trial, there was a hatchet murder, and it was determined to be committed by a Portuguese immigrant who had an extreme rage towards a man who wasn't going to pay him for farm work. He went and killed the man's daughter brutally and waited in the house to kill him. And immediately the defense said, you know, in one of these fantastic newspaper quotes, well, Lizzie's sitting in jail waiting trial. Let's see them try to pin this murder on her too. Here's what happens. Turns out that Portuguese immigrant confesses to those murders, but wasn't even in the United States when the Bordens were murdered. But they never tell the jury that is sequestered. Till the end of the Lizzie Borden trial, the Lizzie Borden jury thought that it could easily have been that Portuguese immigrant who killed the Bordens. And that prejudice, the idea that only a madman, not a woman, could deliver these blows to kill the family, the idea that Lizzie might have been a victim, that no respectable Christian woman could do such a thing or would care about the money or whatever, it really struck them as believable. And fascinatingly, Lizzie had gone a couple of days before and told her friend this big phony story. I think it was a cover story in advance. There's a man who's mad at my father. I'm afraid he's going to come and kill him. I'm living in fear, blah, 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 blah. Here's what John Douglas thinks, and I agree with him. John Douglas thinks that Lizzie kills the stepmother first because of the arrangement with the will, brutally. Waits around for the father to get home, strips naked, and puts the father's coat on like a smock. Kills him with the axe when he's sitting upright, then poses it to look like he fell asleep on his coat, which he never would have done, and makes up a whole cover story about where she is and somebody coming in the house and the whole thing. And then makes up all these ridiculous stories to bide a little time about where Abby was while they're doing the search and to kind of cook her ideas up about what she's going to do. And then everything in the courtroom was basically for effect. Everything was designed for effect. Now, if we look at this chart, and I'll be quick about this part, Chris. What I'm trying to make the audience see is that you start to see these really fascinating similarities, because in both cases, you had a really kind of disliked, cold, detached mother figure, and a father that was potentially abusive, and it was withholding, not withholding money in the Menendez case, but where they would inherit a very large amount of money if these people were, shall we say, eliminated. In both cases, if you scroll down beyond that, you see these little signs of preparation and forethought. So as I mentioned, Lizzie goes and tells that story to the friend to give a cover story, right?
And for the audience that's just joining us, sorry, yeah. I apologize. Menendez is on the right. And Lizzie Borden's on the left. Go ahead.
That's right. And then one of the questions I actually want you to address a little bit is if you saw signs of preparation. But the only one I was able to find was that they went out to try to get these handguns. But in the Lizzie case, I mean, she had even tried to get poison. She claimed it was to clean a sealed coat. I'm surprised she didn't shoplift it. But she tried to get this terrible acid. This poison, she couldn't get it. She locks the door for the signal. There are signs of a forethought there. This is not somebody who exploded into killing somebody. But do you think there was a forethought evident with the brothers?
Oh, I think that once they decided that they needed to do something, that they talked about this and they thought about different things. Nowadays when people are thinking about killing someone, they just go on the internet and they can, look up how to, with that the Florida case where she looked up chloroform and things like that. So in the Menendez case, I think they talked about, and the guns, certainly to protect themselves. Obviously, a handgun would be more protective than a shotgun. And yet they couldn't wait the 3 days.
Right.
Excuse me.
And very lethal weapons that with a lot of overkill, with, as we said earlier, all the injuries facially or to the head. And I think that for us, the interpretation would be that in a domestic situation, if Lizzie's guilty, and I think she's guilty, spoiler alert, if Lizzie did this, and if the Menendez brothers did this, I mean, we know they did. I think that we have to interpret the overkill and the facial injuries as an expression of being deeply upset at a personal figure in your life. Chris, in your investigations of homicides, did you see that was a sign of domestic murders, that there's more of the facial attacking?
Well, I think it was, based on my training experience, that was definitely an indication of possible, personal in nature, that the perpetrator understood or knew potentially the victim, or they were transferring that behavior about somebody else to that victim. And the facial features, attacking the face like that,
right,
are very personal. And with a knife, it's even worse, right? With a gun, you can say, and I'll just use, the Sally case. I mean, she blew his whole jaw off, and that was her husband. But, the other side of that, he had been beating her. And so I think that's more spontaneous in nature, versus if he would have been laying in bed and she would have ambushed him. That would have been much more personal.
I think there's a really interesting symbolism to the weapons that are used, because I think, for example, if you have two males that are being sexually assaulted, there is something strangely symbolic of getting this phallic shotgun and taking the power away from the abusive male and then blowing them away with it. But I also think in the Lizzie case, there was an incident. John Douglas agrees that you can't so quickly dismiss it as having no meaning. But there was this story told that not terribly long before the murders, actually I think maybe even a year before the murders, Lizzie had been keeping birds in the barn. She was, as I said, a huge animal lover. And the father didn't like that local kids were kind of coming by the house and wanted to hunt these birds, might steal them, might whatever. And so he kind of goes in there and hatchets them to death. And Lizzie is horrified by this. You have to understand, when Lizzie died, she left virtually all of that money to like animal organizations. She was an animal, what you might call an animal nut, right? That kind of thing. And my favorite kind of people. And the thing is, it is interesting to think of the symbolism of, you killed all these innocent pets of mine with a hatchet. And now I'm going to do the same thing to you, Dad. That kind of thing. But I think that's kind of fascinating. I mean, it's a little far-fetched, but it's interesting. The symbolism of things is sometimes.
Well, I want to hear Dr. Burgess' opinion. I mean,
what do you think about it?
Yeah, and the choice of a hatchet.
Yeah. Well, not only the choice of a hatchet, but Gary and I had talked about this. It takes a lot of strength, I think, to hit someone. Was she strong? Is there any evidence that she was that strong? And as I said, a hatchet is, of course, in those days, what else would you have? They didn't have guns, right? She could have used a knife, I suppose. But
I think she wanted to poison them, which would have been more passionate.
That would have been more female oriented. Gary, you had a good question. One of the someone asked about, was she naked when did you theorize she was naked when she put the coat on? And
John Douglas thinks so. I agree that it would make a lot of sense. And think how.
Well, then that speaks a little bit more to maybe some incest stuff.
Well, that's something that is worth contemplating. I mean, the one thing John points out that I think is important is that if Bridget could see through the windows, it would be a little weird that you would think nothing of strolling naked into the room where she's just done this and the whole thing. But he wonders if maybe she strips down and puts the coat on as a smock, because the idea being that she knows if she gets any blood anywhere, it's going to be a problem.
But the father's coming home. He's not home yet, right?
No, the idea is that
She
Abby's
kills,
already dead upstairs, and this is when she goes to kill the father. She would strip.
right.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting that
Very
that's
Yeah,
But
and the crime scene in itself had
Yeah.
to be a mess. I bet you could go there even to this day and still find enzyme of blood.
you can.
in that wound.
That's proved, Chris.
I'm sorry?
They did. A few
Oh,
years ago, they did a documentary where somebody went there with a chemical agent and found there's still blood in the wood of that house. And what's really interesting is the blood does not correspond with where those bodies were.
Oh, that's
At some
fascinating.
point, I'm telling
It
you, at
is
some point,
interesting.
there was
Where
staging.
were they? That's a small house. Where
I think they found it in. Now, look, this part, don't quote me on this, but I think I have to go back to the documentary I saw it a few years ago. But I think the wood was found in the area of the house that communicated with the basement ceiling. So probably the kitchen. There was probably cleaning up of blood at some point. But I'll double check that fact of where they found it. But
You're going to have cast
found-
off. You're
Yeah.
going to have. It's not going to be on the ceilings. I mean, every time that hatchet goes down and comes up,
right.
it's going in both directions, right, Dr. M?
Yes, absolutely. Where was Bridget during all this? Isn't it true that
That's right.
Bridget was never seen after this?
Well, what happens is it's very, very interesting. In the trial, I really think she was protecting Lizzie. I really do.
Right.
One of the things that Bridget testified to was that she took Mr. Borden's boots off to help him lay down, like as if she's supporting the cover story that he took this nap. But in the post-mortem photo, he's got them on. You can see it clearly.
Right.
I have
Right.
it.
Yeah,
He's
he's in his boots. Yeah.
It makes no sense that, I think she was protecting a little, but she moves away and she never talks about the case again.
We need to look at this with the timeline, Gary. The timeline, something's wrong with the timeline.
With what? Of
The
where?
timeline. I think there's more happens, I bet, than
Yes, I agree.
something else that goes on.
In that hour between the murders.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's only an hour, whether it's off even more.
Some people have said that it was longer, but that's what the body temperatures and other things, digestion and stuff. Now, so just to get back to this quickly, in both cases, the murder is in the house with a lethal weapon, and that the weapons are used in an overkill kind of fashion, all above the neck. If we scroll down a little bit, Chris.
The same on Menendez.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's very interesting. And you pointed out that it was like hot. I'm sure, maybe emotional tempers heat doesn't help. And so that similar degree of incredible intensity. The degree of organization is interesting because in the Borden case, if you didn't know the potential motive of Lizzie, it really looked like somebody in a kind of frenzy came in there and just like butchered in this kind of disorganized way. And even the idea of like hiding in a closet, which is where the killer would have had to have killed if it wasn't Lizzie. He would have to have hidden in a closet with Lizzie walking around for an hour would be a pretty disorganized thing to do. And then like sitting in there with all that rage and then bursting out an hour later to kill the father would be very strange. And in the Menendez case, this is really a question for you, Anne. Would you say there's a disorganized quality to that crime scene?
Yeah, I testified it was disorganized. Now, and the other thing I just quickly thought of is in both cases, the weapon is missing. They never find the axe, do they? And they never find the shotguns.
Well, they found multiple axes, hatchet-like instruments in the basement, but they were never able to link it directly.
Right, the right one.
Right. One of them had hair and blood on it, but it was like from an animal. One of them had like cinders on it. It looked almost like maybe somebody burned something or on it. Whatever. One had a handle missing. I always wondered why they didn't check Lizzie's hands for splinters and things like that, because she would have been repetitively hatcheting. There would have been probably something. And Chris, wouldn't you say? You would have thought of that, I'm sure, that there would have been her hands would have been calloused or something from wielding a hatchet, almost 30 to 35 times.
I mean,
Yeah.
she could have had a blister on, but remember in that time, right? That was their main ability to keep warm. So they had to cut wood, and I mean, so she could have had calluses all over the place.
Right,
But,
and that whole thing of not making much of blood because she could have had a period was very Victorian.
I think that was very fascinating, and I'm sitting here just fascinated listening to both of you.
Well, we love this. We eat this up because
the other
look at the correlations here.
I know the other correlation I never thought of is I testified on the Menendez case that if they had only checked the boy's hands, they would have had gun residue.
I'm going to add that to the chapter.
Yeah, they would have solved it immediately. That's a great one. Yeah.
I love that. You see, I love the synergy. Yeah. Now, what's interesting is in this thing here where it says theories other than family dynamics. So part of the problem is when they investigated this case. Now, Chris, you've investigated so many murders. I'm sure you already thought of this, but there's no sign of sexual assault and there's no sign of robbery. Andrew has money in his pocket. He still got the ring on, that the daughter gave him. So if those motives are taken off the table, what the heck else could have been the reason somebody did this? So then they start thinking about the mentally ill idea, a mentally ill local foreigner, which never bore out. Nobody saw anybody going in or out of that house. They thought about Uncle John, by the way, but Uncle John had an airtight motive. He was visiting some people across town. The one weird thing about that was that he remembered everything so photographically that it felt as if he rehearsed it. He even remembered the number on the cap the conductor was wearing on the trolley, like as if he thought he was going to need that information, which is very strange, but they ruled him out. There really was just no evidence that anybody else was even in that house other than Lizzie and the victims at the time of the killings. And in the Menendez case, obviously, and they would have checked. There were no signs of sexual assault, no signs of robbery.
Right.
What motive they possibly have thought for a stranger to do this?
Yeah. Green-eyed Pie just made a very interesting suggestion that I think we have looked at. Thank you, Lizzie. Lizzie was secretly a lesbian and may have been having an affair with the family.
Oh, yeah. I read a whole book on that subject.
Oh,
but
you buy it?
No, but
okay.
No, because Bridget, there is no reason to believe that Bridget was anything but heterosexual. She had been male. She married a man afterwards. We don't know if she was bisexual, but there was no evidence for that. Okay. And the thing is that it is fascinating, however, and I'm really happy somebody brought this up. When Lizzie inherits the money after she's acquitted, she and her sister inherit the money. They go live together on the hill in that snobby, area that they wanted to live in Hill and Maplecroft, they call it. Lizzie calls it. And they have a huge fight and they never talk again. And part of the reason they have a fight is that Lizzie starts living with a woman. She starts living with Nance O'Neill, who was a silent movie actress, thought to at least be bisexual. And the idea is that it was suspected that she might have entered into a relationship with her, and it was a great scandal. That did raise questions retroactively, not at the time, but retroactively, if perhaps an additional motive was that the father took some issue with the sexuality of his daughter, and that she may have resented the idea that she needed a man societally to get out of that house. And that's a very interesting little story. The question of having a relationship with Bridget, I think, is rejected. I think John also rejects it. But that is a fascinating little development that happens later. They never talked until the day they died. They're buried next to each other, but they didn't talk, partly because of the partying and so forth that Lizzie was doing. She played it up. Now, the other thing is in the Menendez case, they just sort of confessed after they got rid of the shot. They hid everything or whatever. They eventually just kind of confessed, right, that they did it.
Well, no, Eric is the one that finally, and he said, just walking with his therapist or something, not even in the office, we did it. And this created a problem with Lyle, because Lyle didn't know that he said that. And so there was some problem between the two of them at that particular point.
I got it. Interesting. So there's that same thing which I suspect, I don't know if you do, Ann, but I suspect that Abby had an awareness of Lizzie's guilt. And proof of that is that there was a famous incident which was testified to at the time of the trial by a guard at the jail where Lizzie was being held, where Lizzie and Abby were having a visit, and the guard distinctly heard Lizzie say to Abby, "You've given me away, haven't you?"
Oh,
And she turned, she in fact during the
oh,
incident, Lizzie faces the wall, turns away from her sister and faces the wall and won't even look at her. And that testimony got thrown out too.
But
And
and I have a question,
Yeah.
Gary, just real fast. I
Yeah.
want to ask Ann a question. And I have a question. Did Eric ever mention anything to you about? I mean, he was straightforward and said, "Yeah, but this is what happened, right?" I mean, there was
yeah.
no intent to kind of conceal that.
Yeah, see, that's what I was confused about. So you're saying Lyle did try, but Eric didn't.
No, Eric became so depressed and suicidal that they put him in therapy, and that's what the therapist testimony was. Now it got into a big hassle because the mistress of Oziel, the therapist, heard about it, and Oziel had her sit outside of the therapist's office in case anything happened. She was to call the police, but she's the one that did them go to the police, not the therapist. That's what we had always said, is that was so unethical that he didn't work with Eric to say, let's get it to the police. But it was the girlfriend, the mistress, that went to the police.
Right. But now we have this. I mean, I'm not sure what was in place at the time, but now we've got these mandated reporter kind of laws. I mean, if a child is reporting,
Right.
you have no choice but to let Child Protective Services sort it out.
Yeah.
And Chris, you would know, in California at the time, would they have been mandated to report? Even at the time in
1989.
Well, it would have been mandatory reporting if there was a death involved. But then again, you have, doctor, patient,
right.
privilege.
Well, that was a big fight of getting the tapes. Then the therapist wanted to put on tape that they did it, and then he would keep the tape. I mean, it was really unethical what he did. Absolutely. And I think he obviously lost his license, which he should have.
Yeah, because at that point, if it's during the therapy session and it's not, if it's a court order situation and they release it, the suspect says, "Hey, yeah, I did it. Okay, and this is why." Okay, blah 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 blah. For the defense, that's attorney-client privilege. None of that.
Sure.
None of that leaves that office.
Right. And that's what they had to. There were, I think, several tapes, and they had to court had to rule on each one of them whether they were privileged or whether they could be released. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, and the fact that this therapist, circumvents that rule by putting somebody, in within earshot.
Right.
That's
right.
messed up.
Well, if a child comes to a therapist and says that he or she is being abused, you are mandated to call Child Protective Services, and Child Protective Services sends somebody in and sorts it out. If there's a credible threat, you don't even miss a beat, because the reality is that that just cannot slip through the cracks. That's unacceptable. So that's a really, really sad story.
Yeah, I mean, even today, if you go in and you talk, if let's say you're retained by the defense as an investigator, hypothetically, and you go in and talk to a client and they lay it all out, you're obligated by law to keep your mouth shut and just talk to your attorney. If it leaves that room, that individual goes to jail completely. And so, but yeah. So I'm curious. What I want to get back to your thought process, because you testified this was a disorganized crime scene in the
I did.
Yeah, I'm interested in that.
Menendez situation. I'm sorry. What brought you to that conclusion? Do you recall some of those facts?
Yeah, some of those facts had to do with the guns that were used, totally inappropriate for what they for the type of shooting that they did. What else? There was, well, the biggest thing was if both brothers were there when the police arrived, and that they had only done a check of their hands, they would have arrested them. And the brothers, this was hard for the brothers because they kept wondering why they weren't being arrested. And so that wasn't part. The thing was, they thought they would be, that there'd be some ending to all this. So the other thing is that all of the shells were picked up. Some would have pointed to that, but my thinking on that is if they had read any kind of crime stories, that was the way you got rid of evidence, so to speak. So that and they got rid of the guns. We don't know. They claimed that they threw them over one of the big cliffs in California or Beverly Hills, wherever.
Yeah, and they never found them.
Never found them.
Okay.
Never found them.
Okay, sorry, Gary. I didn't mean to.
No, I wanted to know too.
Let's get to the.
And look at how long look at how long it took for them. It took 7 months till finally Eric is the one that just about he just couldn't contain it anymore.
Right.
Yeah,
well,
and Gary, just ignore the ham sandwich.
I don't even.
I need a doggone ham sandwich. So.
No. It's interesting because ham sandwich is a slang for a gun that's planted, for a killing. So I don't know what the heck that joke meant, but it doesn't make any sense to me. Anyway, so
public reactions.
So what? Yeah. So what do you think of the comparison?
So first of all, there can be no question, and I mean, we both agree that these were totally sensational cases, partly because they involved intense family drama, rich, which we could all relate to, and yet with these kind of rich people, I think, in this really weird way, there's always been, especially since I think the Industrial Revolution, there's been this kind of weird fascination with watching like the people that we're envious of have these Icarus-like falls, and turn out to be horrible people, who get theirs, that kind of thing. It's this weird thing. I don't know why. But so anyway, there's this kind of fascination in both cases. And this gets right to what I was saying earlier about what Michael and I wrote about. These two cases basically boil down to that you don't know what category on the scale Michael and I would put them into unless we really could go there and look into their minds and see the motive. Because at worst, what you were dealing with was a kind of elimination murder or a very vicious aggression murder, right? Where you had two siblings in the Menendez case, at least one sibling in the Borden case, who just sort of says, in this calculated way, we got to get rid of this person because they're harmful. There were these dirty secrets in the family. I'm furious. I'm being hurt. I got to escape this situation, but we'll also get a lot of money, right? There's that. At best, what you're dealing with is a situation where it was a purely emotional, passionate thing of people who felt trapped and couldn't care less about any money. They basically just wanted to get out of a bad situation where there might have been abuse in the Borden case, and there seems like there clearly was in the Menendez case. And in those cases, the outcry from the public is free them. They've suffered enough. You're making them suffer more by, it's almost like a kind of self-defense that when a kid or a young person would try to get out of a situation like that. And I think that because of that, I think we both feel that if abuse could be substantiated, this is now going to turn into one of those cases that Michael and I talked about where you can almost predict that the outcry is going to be set them free, like the Casturian sisters. Is that your feeling also, Anne?
Well, that's actually what happened. It was about 5 years ago, and I was approached by a student from Northeastern saying they had formed this Free the Menendez group, and had I heard of it and blah, 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 that. And I invited them over. I always do the case in my class. And so there was this movement to get them. I think the other important thing that's happening right now is that the family, Kitty's family, and everyone except there's one that doesn't, wants them out and keeps saying, bring them home. We want them home. That's highly unusual, I think, and should have some kind of impact, I would hope, on the resentencing. I'm glad it's you had asked, Chris, I'm glad it's a resentencing, because it doesn't mean that the trial has to be held again or they have to go through any of this. It just has to be in today's, ruling. Would they be free? And evidently there's that rule at California, under 26, you're treated as a child. They would resentence them for 50 years, 25 each. And so because they're under 26, they would be immediately free. I think that's what the attorney Garagos has is hoping.
Well, we're seeing this movement, and I'm sorry, Chris, we're seeing this movement now in a lot of states toward it being sort of a mitigating factor in murders if somebody has been abused or under enormous emotional stress or domestic violence, because it becomes more like a manslaughter situation, a passion situation. And I think, Chris, it would be good if we cap this. I mean, I want to hear what you were just about to say, but it'd be good if we could cap this by basically saying, why didn't they find Lizzie guilty, and why did they find Menendez guilty? And is there a bias that has something to do with gender and the configuration of the jury, which in many ways is more fascinating than the cases, because otherwise they would be kind of garden variety stories, So, Chris, what were you about to say?
I think it's going to be a fascinating next couple of weeks to see, when these guys, and I think this correlation that you two have put together, full disclosure, I told you up front, right? Or I told the audience, I didn't know how close this was going to be parallel. I mean, it's like you're watching two trains go down the track, and it's just like, okay, who's going to get to the station first? And if so, what are going to be the circumstances there? But we have some really neat questions I want to put up here. Are we done with the chart, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just that last point about, I don't know if you want to say anything about it, but do you think the configuration of the jury and the gender of the accused figured in?
I know it did. I know it did, because I talked with one juror on the first trial, and she said the first thing that they started out the deliberations wrong. They asked for a show of hands for how many go for first degree and how many go for manslaughter. Those were the two, and it went right down the middle. Women for manslaughter, men for first degree, and they couldn't budge the men on that, and they weren't going to give in.
Say in the Lizzie case,
and then the second, in the Lizzie case, it was all men, and of course they were going to be, from what you already said, I think that's a good point. The second Menendez trial, they did not allow anything on the abuse in, and Lyle did not testify. So it was a slam dunk. All you have to prove in first degree is that they murdered them, which that was easy. They admitted it. So it was not
one of the things that I think I was hoping we would touch on very quickly that has bugged me about the comparison, and I really want your thoughts on this. I think the audience will find it fascinating, is personality-wise, Lizzie Borden was a little complicated, because in addition to the weird relationship with the father, it is intriguing that she had no romantic relationships at all. We don't know what was going on with her sexual identity, which is interesting. We don't judge her for that. It's just interesting. She would have had to have lived a very secretive life if that were the case. She had this apparent shoplifting problem, which is kind of interesting. She seems to be able to lie without batting an eye, but she contradicts herself. She's not particularly good at it. She has an anger problem. She was described as being pretty melancholic. She had a history of kind of like black moods, like, and hopelessness, which is kind of interesting. She had a very charitable side and had that obsession with animals, which is really interesting, I guess, because they're more predictable than people. Like I said about the Kohlberger situation, about why he kept the dog alive, you know. I think some people find animals more predictable. And it's also interesting that you know, she could hold these grudges like forever. Like if she was mad at somebody, just completely never talk to them again. She also led this kind of paranoid existence after the trial, where she would always be chauffeured everywhere and wear a veil and the whole thing, because these street urchins would kind of make fun of her or come to the house and run away and whatever. But she never left town. She had a kind of pride that she would not just pick up and move to somebody. It had to be there right into town. And there was something about her that almost seems a kind of dissociated. For example, when they did the autopsies, they did it right in the house. And the parents were there in the dining room. And Lizzie's just walking around, not shedding a single tear, with the parents in the room. You know, and she doesn't cry until she's acquitted. There's something about her that is interesting personality-wise. So my question is, when it comes to the Menendez brothers, were there any signs of aberrant personality in either of them? Lyle, for example, I know some people have wondered about him having a history that was a little more suggestive of having a very different personality than Eric. But so the question is, were they like lovely children, or were there a little trouble, like with Lizzie?
Well, no, I never heard anything like that, but they're very controlled.
Yeah.
You know, and they were very rigid in terms of a schedule, because that's the way they were brought up. The father told them what they had to do every single minute. It was an incredible regimen that they lived under. So they only had each other. I didn't get the feeling that they shared much of what they were going through with either of the parents. Although I just don't see them. Lizzie certainly has a much more lively character structure but being devoid of any feeling, that wasn't the way the Menendez brothers were.
Somebody asked about diagnostics. I don't think we should speculate about Menendez brothers, but I think with Lizzie, I mean, she's deceased, and I think, you know, looking at it retroactively, my sense is that she had probably some kind of cluster B personality organization. And I think she probably was prone to depression. She seemed to be somebody who felt very hopeless and entitled to take matters into her own hands if she was unhappy, which I think you also see in shoplifting. But there is a lot. But the interesting thing, is that even when she's worth about $6 million after the father dies, she shoplifts again.
Yeah.
So,
sure.
So what's that about psychologically? Well, anyway, so
let's have some questions. I have some questions here.
Yeah.
So I'm going to put them up here. Did Lyle abuse Eric?
I never got that information. I know it's been a question that I'm often asked, and I think it came out. I think where it comes from is this first Netflix show called Monsters. Evidently, there are a couple of scenes in that I have never heard. So I don't know if they.
Interesting. Okay. The next one here is there a diagnosis as battered children syndrome?
Yes, there is.
Could you break that down a little bit more, Doc?
Yeah, that often is for where you have more physical abuse than sexual abuse. And it fits much more with the battered woman syndrome, which is there's literally a lot of physical injury, and then the symptoms really fall from that. They're very different than the sexual symptoms that you get in sexual abuse.
Interesting.
So I think you're right, Chris. I think we're going to have to wait and see what happens on the Menendez case. Nothing we can do till it goes to a judge, I understand, or a parole makes recommendations.
Okay, so this one is one question I have for Dr. Gary and Ann is how do we know that Lizzie knew the mother had to die first to inherit. So that's question one. That is true, but how would she know that?
That was common knowledge. There was a first will, and the whole idea was that there was talk of writing another will. And in fact, one of the things John Douglas has pointed out is that no a second will was ever found, and it doesn't seem anybody even went looking for it. But the idea is that that was commonly known in the family what the arrangements were going to be if the father died, because you have to remember the father was no spring chicken. That they were sort of sitting around thinking this guy could pass away at any time. You know, they just recently gave, Abby gave some property away to her sister. She's going to do the same thing if he dies first, and she gets everything, and she doesn't like us. Why would she give us anything? And so the ordering is absolutely essential, and that the mother dies first, which causes everything to instantly go to Andrew, and Andrew dies an hour later, and now everything goes to the daughters, which completely screwed Abby's family. But I'm not sure Lizzie cared very much about that fact. But like I said, she was pretty spiteful.
Interesting. So, is there anything you wanted to say, Doc Burgess?
No.
Beck Carter says, Leslie? This cold is killing me. Smalls. Did Lizzie have multiple personalities?
No. I have to tell you that there have been less than 20 authentic documented cases of multiple personality in the history of psychiatry. And, I think what people mean by that is something like temporal lobe epilepsy, causing major personality changes or extreme dissociative states. I think she might have had on the spectrum of dissociation some symptoms, again, and not uncommon in trauma. This kind of ability to compartmentalize where she's not even crying or anything that they're dead. Even if in the cases of people who are furious at a family member and murder them, they tend to be very confused. They don't know if they love them or hate them, or there could be tears or whatever. But you get some people who have this kind of totally dissociative, detached reaction. When the inquest came and Lizzie was rambling all over the place, they attributed it to her being on drugs that were given to her to sleep. But she could have also been kind of dissociated. But I do not believe she killed in the context of dissociation, or she had multiple. I think she just was not a particularly well integrated person. She probably had a personality disorder, would be my guess, but not multiple personalities.
Okay, so Deborah asks, so do both doctors believe the brother should be released?
Oh, I'm going to give that to Ann to answer.
Oh, I do. How 35 years? No, come on. They killed their parents. They regretted it the second Eric. The minute after. So they have to live with that. I think people think that they hated their parents. They didn't hate their parents. They feared their parents, and that something was going to happen to them.
Right. Well, let's put it like this. The younger brother was 18 at the time of the murders, right?
Right.
And let's say 18 years of his life taken from him. And then he goes to jail for double that?
Right.
First you lose 18 years, and then you go to jail for 35. One wonders if that's not a touch of overkill in the sentence.
I'll say. The other thing I'll say about it is that they lost all hope for appeal in 2005. That had done its last appellate, and they could have just done nothing, but they have done a lot in the years that have gone by. They have established this real green project that a lot of people talk about. They're at the Donahue prison, which you have to earn. You can't just be sent there. You have to do good things. They don't have one disciplinary point in their, what they call their C file. So they are exemplary, if you want to look at it that way, in terms of 35 years in their prisons. And I think that speaks very well. Then the other thing is, are they a danger to society? And I'd say, no, this is a domestic killing. And most domestic killings, they don't kill again. And I think that the DA Garcon has resentenced like something like 300 cases, and of the 300, a handful have repeated, and they were not any. They were all on like different charges. It wasn't an assault charge or a murder charge or anything like that. It was something else. So they have a good record. I think they have good evidence, if you will, for the reasons that they should be resentenced and released.
Well,
Okay.
I think you'd agree, Ann, that because the motives, whatever the motives were, none of them really have to do with personality or fantasy. They were all situational things that are
Right.
no longer present. So
Yeah.
the notion that they would reoffend doesn't make a lot of sense. In Lizzie's case, the thing that seemed personality based was stealing, and she continued that after the situation
Right.
changed. But the murderousness was not part of some kind of free floating fantasy of the world. In fact, she liked other people, basically, especially, as I said, she loved animals and was very charitable and all that. She just wasn't liked by the world, but she didn't go around killing people who hated her. So, I think it's interesting to think about it that way, that in neither situation was killing part inherent to the fantasy life of the individual. Although one wonders how long they thought about doing it.
Yeah. Chris, I can answer this last question. I have not spoken to the brothers in the past few months, but I will say that the drawings and the update on the Menendez case is part of our second book, which will be out. It's out in the summer or the spring, next spring or summer.
Okay.
So people can see that.
Well, as always, you two are the most fascinating brains and minds that that come to the interview room. I mean, that's for sure. You guys know, I mean, I recently had to give a presentation in North Carolina, and I told that, a lot of folks don't know, but I was born at Camp Lejeune. And I know. I started my lecture with, as you can tell, my mother drank a lot of water on the base.
Oh, no.
They all cracked up. I had 200 homicide investigators from across the state of North Carolina, and it was a really neat little time to meet with everybody. And one of our gals from Super Sleuths was there. I'm sure she'll reach out to you, Ann, and tell you. And by the way, I'm always honored to have you on the program, but even more importantly, to call you a friend. And I learned so much from you, both. I mean, both Gary. I was telling Gary earlier, he's like, where have you been? What have you been doing? And this cold has just been racking me, knocking me down. And I also get to that point where, and I don't know if you guys go through this, but where you do this all the time, 24/7, 365 in terms of, blood and guts and everything. And there are times where I just shut the valve.
Yeah.
And I sit on my porch with my guitar and just kind of, run away for a little while. And so I really do love you both. And I appreciate always your patience with me. And if the audience has not gone and got these two books off of Amazon, please do me a favor. These books are in the link below this, thumbnail. Get these two books. Drive the numbers up on Amazon. They're fascinating reads, and I mean, these are. Think about this, YouTube. This is Dr. Ann Burgess and Dr. Gary Brucato. Ann is a legend. And I mean, she literally is a legend. And, like Dr. Michael Stone, who has moved off into another place. But Ann has been doing this, for a couple of weekends. And obviously, her husband married way up. That is an obvious situation, but she's trained thousands of police officers, FBI agents, just across the country, nurses, doctors. I mean, she started so many things that if you really want to see a little piece of Ann's life, go to the Hulu series.
Oh yeah.
Right, Gary?
Yep.
Go to the Hulu series about Ann's life, and you will realize you've had the opportunity tonight to ask a living legend in crime who is right in front of you. You've had a chance to ask her questions, and for that, I will be forever grateful that you take the time out of your day and out of your family to be here. So thank you both this evening. Dr. Burgess, seeing how you testified in this case, I'm going to allow you to have the last word. And plus, my mother, who's from Boston, would never forgive me.
Okay. Well, my last word is certainly that to get this information out to your audience. They're a wonderful audience. All the comments that they make, I always love reading them. And so you've just got the best. And we always think about the victims. It's very, very important. And in this case, on the Menendez case, they certainly were victimized and traumatized, and they did what others have done who have been abused, and something we have to work. One of the reasons why you have to get them into treatment early so that they don't behave in this way. So we try to treat children early and get the resolution so they don't, what we call, reenact any of the aggression. So, and thank you for having us on. I was so glad to do this with Gary, this Lizzie Borden case. I loved it. It was lots of fun.
Awesome. Gary, last on Lizzie.
Well, all I'll say is I hope that when the book comes out that we're talking about, Chris and I are the editors, and Ann and a whole slew of fantastic people from the Cold Case Foundation have written chapters. Each one is sort of like a master class and a subtopic. Even as the editor, I'm amazed at what I'm learning reading them. I think the audience is going to love the book, and you'll get into the Lizzie case in very intricate detail because it's a very rich one. And I really just want to thank the two of you. And I think I can't echo enough your feelings about Ann. Ann is a very dear friend, and I have the pleasure of working with her all the time. I'm spoiled, and you.
And you do my classes, so I love you. My classes love you.
Well, we're very close. So I'm very grateful. Great gift in my life.
Okay. Well, awesome.
Thanks,
aloha, everybody. We're so grateful. Are you guys ready to go to Hawaii?
Yeah, ready
Thank
to go.
you to all of our doctors, our nurses, our first responders, anybody out there serving. We're grateful to each and every one of you. Please continue to be safe. And also remember those folks in Maui who lost their homes, lost everything in the fires. They're still in need. And of course, the hurricane victims across the southeastern part of the United States. And continue to pray for those who are in need and less fortunate than ourselves. So have a great night, everybody. Aloha.
Hard working every day, I'm stressed out 24/7, babe. No timeouts, wish we could fly away. You and I go to our favorite place. Oh yeah, make special memories together. I'll be your company now and forever. I say we fly away, you and me, go to our favorite place. Feeling the sun on my face in Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. I need a summer breeze, some fresh air to put my mind at ease. No cares. You wanna come with me away. Don't hesitate now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. We'll never come down. We're going away. Yeah, we're going away. You and me. Feeling the sun on my face in a while.